Hi, this is Bill, and this is Progpaganda. Over the course of our recent episodes on this YouTube channel, we've been reviewing our list of 25 proto-prog albums released in the late 1960s that influenced and helped provide the foundation for the genre of music now known as progressive rock. In our first episode in this sequence, we identified the list of 25 albums and went over the criteria that we used to select them. If you haven't seen that episode yet, you can check that out here on YouTube at this link. We've also, since that first episode, done deep dives on 15 of the albums that are on the list, covering their content and influence, with the various albums taken from the years 1965, 66, 67, and 68. All those episodes are on this channel as well. If you haven't seen those or have missed any of them over the course of the last couple of months since we've been doing this work, by all means go back and check them out. We hope you enjoy what you find. Today's episode covers an album from October of 1968, and it's a masterpiece, the Jimi Hendrix Experience's Electric Ladyland. By late 1967, when the Jimi Hendrix Experience began work on the songs that would comprise Electric Ladyland, the Experience, Jimi Hendrix, Noel Redding, and Mitch Mitchell, were international superstars. They took the world by storm with the release of their first album, Are You Experienced, in May of 1967, and really became household words in June of 1967 following their appearance at the Monterey Pop Festival. They would later make a second album in 1967, Axis Bold as Love, which was a little bit more experimental in its content, but nevertheless a very strong selling album as well. Both Are You Experienced and Axis were top 10 albums on both sides of the Atlantic, with Are You Experienced in particular spawning several hit singles both from the album and as non-LP singles. Are You Experienced would be something of a different color, and in a good way. Jimi Hendrix decided by late 1967 that he could take a little bit more liberty in the studio than had been allowed him on the earlier albums. Both Are You Experienced and Axis had been produced by Hendrix's manager, Chas Chandler. Chandler was, of course, a music industry veteran. He had been the bassist with the original version of Eric Burdon's band, The Animals, playing on various sizable hits with that band, including House of the Rising Sun, It's My Life, and other tunes. In that capacity, Chandler got to firsthand watch the production techniques of one of the first successful independent rock music producers in the UK, Mickey Most. And Chandler tended, in handling Hendrix in the studio, to follow the Mickey Most playbook, which basically said, record quickly, work with first and second takes, and keep the budget to a minimum so you can get a good record out and exploit that from a promotional and profit perspective. And really, Are You Experienced in particular, the production was fairly scaled down. The only real embellishments that were made were various overdubs that were pursued in the studio by Chandler with assistance from his recording engineer, the great Eddie Kramer, who also participated on Axis and would have a big role on Electric Ladyland. By the time of Electric Ladyland, Hendrix felt he could experiment significantly further, and did so in several ways. The first thing that Hendrix was interested in exploring was instrumentation, including instrumentation beyond the Jimi Hendrix Experience itself. The experience had been created very quickly in the spring of 1967 by Chas Chandler upon taking Hendrix to the UK in search of a record contract and also to expose him to the British music scene. Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell were hired as much because of their looks as because of their musicianship. Indeed, Noel Redding wasn't a bass guitarist by trade. He was a lead guitar player and had already, by the time of Electric Ladylands being made, was beginning to explore that interest outside of the experience with his own band, Fat Mattress. In some cases, Fat Mattress gigs and sessions interfered with experience work on Electric Ladyland, which forced Hendrix to work without Redding, oftentimes playing the bass himself. But it wasn't just issues or dissatisfaction with Redding that Hendrix wanted to explore. He wanted to bring in other players besides Noel and Mitch, and did so. There are notable guests that appear across the Electric Ladyland album on various songs. In particular, Steve Winwood, then of the band Traffic, plays Hammond organ on Voodoo Child, while Jack Cassidy of the Jefferson Airplane plays bass. Chris Wood, also of Traffic, plays flute on 1983, and their Traffic bandmate, Dave Mason, plays 12-string acoustic guitar and the bass on All Along the Watchtower. Hendrix was also interested in exploring the capabilities of the studio with Eddie Kramer. Recording of the album took much longer and took more budget financially than was allocated, which upset Chas Chandler to the point where he would ultimately leave the sessions midway through. He did produce a couple of tracks on the album, but did not receive credit for them, Hendrix taking credit for the entire piece of work. Hendrix was interested in exploring new avenues of music also, including some long-form pieces. Voodoo Child runs nearly 15 minutes and most of side one of the album in vinyl format. 1983 runs 13 minutes and is nearly all of side 3. Hendrix wasn't particularly interested in singles on the Electric Ladyland sessions, although one song, All Along the Watchtower, was a very successful single, particularly in the United States, where it hit the top 40, something that was rare for Hendrix's music. Hendrix's music was mostly played on FM rock radio in the States in 1967 and 68, but he actually received some AM radio airplay with his remake of this Bob Dylan classic. All Along the Watchtower impressed Bob Dylan, in fact, tremendously, to where, following Hendrix's rendition of the song, and particularly after Hendrix's death in 1970, when Dylan played the song himself, he would tend to follow Hendrix's arrangement, both as a nod and tribute to Jimi, recognizing that Jimi had made the song his own. Electric Ladyland was Hendrix's biggest hit, particularly in the United States, where it was his only #1 album and stayed on the charts for a while. No small feat there. It was a double album, and of course had the heftier price tag that went with that. Hendrix was also competing directly with the Beatles for the top spot in that time frame, as the Beatles' White Album came out around the same time as Electric Ladyland did. From a progressive rock perspective, Electric Ladyland is an important album insofar as that it truly represents an artist, in fact an artist in Hendrix's case, working through a relatively small label and management company through Track Records. Track was distributed by Polydor, but basically had artistic control over its product. And Hendrix took advantage of this in a manner that few other artists could at the time. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones, of course, also superstars, were able to do that, but they primarily were able to do it through, in the Beatles' case, relationships with people from the record company, as opposed to, in Hendrix's case, he was doing it outside of a record company structure, primarily on his own for this album, with assistance from Eddie Kramer. Eddie Kramer became a fixture on Hendrix's albums as recording engineer and ultimately would become a producer in his own right, in a manner that was also not typical for the day. Most top-line record producers in the late 60s were associated as staff producers with record labels. Kramer obviously was an independent and would remain so through most of his career. Electric Ladyland is a terrific album. It's considered the highlight of Hendrix's career by most fans and appears on top 500 lists of the greatest albums of all time regularly, and it deserves to be considered as such. It's a wonderful record by a musician that was obviously taken from us too soon. Electric Ladyland was not just the last Jimi Hendrix Experience album, it was the last studio album that was released by Jimi Hendrix in his lifetime. There have, of course, been attempts by people close to Hendrix, most notably by Kramer, to envision what Jimi's projects going forward after his death in 1970 might have looked like. We obviously will never know for sure. What we do know for sure is that Jimi Hendrix was one of a handful of musicians in the late 1960s that helped change the world of music in general, and certainly did have an impact on prog rock in terms of the independence that purveyors of this new medium would be given. Anyway, that is it for this episode. We hope you enjoyed it as always. Again, feel free to check out our previous episodes in this channel. If you enjoy the channel, please subscribe. If you liked this episode, please let us know as well, and don't hesitate to leave comments for us. We take those seriously and will respond to whatever you have to say and to any ideas you have for future installments on this channel. Our next episode will cover an album that was an early hallmark of progressive rock from one of its strongest musicians, Keith Emerson, with his band The Nice. Ars Longa, Vita Brevis is next on our list. Thanks again for joining us. You take care. Bye-bye.